to this session. As Joy mentioned, I'm Nicholas Davis. I wear a few hats in addition to being moderator today. I'm a professor of practice at the Thunderbird School of Global Management, which is part of Arizona State University, and a managing director at Swift Partners. And like Nima, I spend a lot of my time focusing on innovation, emerging technologies, and governance, with a particular focus right now on innovation in the vaccine supply chain with Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. But the star of today's session is indeed Nima Elmi, the former head of government affairs at the World Economic Forum's Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, a young global leader and a great friend. And today I'm going to be asking Nima about the concept of agile governance. It's absolutely clear, as we've heard from the previous session, that governments around the world need to do more to keep up to date with the challenges they face leaning into the future. A more agile government is absolutely vital to reflect the pace of change that we're seeing in technology, not just technology, but the pace of change in society, geopolitics, and politics as well. And the question here is, what do we need to change to remain agile or to become more agile? And in particular, I'll be discussing with Nima what kinds of collaborations are required in order to make that happen in practice. So Nima, thanks so much for spending this time with us today. I guess the opening question to you is, what is agile governance really, and why is it important in this crazy time that we call, or at least some of us call, the Fourth Industrial Revolution?
Good morning, Nick, and welcome to the audience. This is a really, really exciting discussion, very topical, very timely. And why should we care about agile governance? Well, first, in terms of what it actually means, Nick and I were authors of a seminal white paper about reimagining policymaking for the Fourth Industrial Revolution back in early 2018, where we defined the notion of agile governance as adaptive, human-centered, inclusive, and sustainable policymaking. That's essentially a lot of buzzwords, but the basic requirement for us was to act as a call to action for policymakers around the world to conceptualize that the notion of governance had in and of itself changed as a result of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And so I think before we get more deeply into this discussion, Nick, as you co-authored, the kind of seminal book on the Fourth Industrial Revolution with Klaus Schwab, I'd love to have you explain what we mean by the Fourth Industrial Revolution before we kind of tackle the nitty-gritty of agile governance in this new world.
No, thanks, Nima. I think this is important scene setting, because whatever kind of organization you engage in or work with, or however you experience daily life, everyone's talking about the role of emerging technologies and the changes undergoing organizations as a result. For the work that Nima and I did at the World Economic Forum, the concept of the Fourth Industrial Revolution is it's a metaphor. It's a way of thinking through those changes without focusing purely on the technology and digital technologies in particular. And I guess at the heart of this concept is the idea that we're entering an age where we're taking for granted digital infrastructure. We're taking for granted the ability to store, communicate, and process information in new ways and increasingly exciting ways in the biological world, in the digital world, in the physical world. And that causes us to experience new challenges, new opportunities. And in particular, that vision for the Fourth Industrial Revolution is a normative one. So it's one that says, actually, all those things that Nima mentioned in relation to agile governance, the inclusivity, the adaptability, etc., we need to actually consciously build those into our vision of a technologically driven future in different ways. So, Nima, look, back to you. That concept of agile governance sounds quite aspirational. Let's just pause for a minute and reflect on some of the other terms that come in and out of dialogue on this topic of the future of government. And one of them is this idea of Gov Tech. So can you just quickly give us a sense of what's the difference or the overlap between GovTech and agile governance in your mind?
That's a very good question, and I'll come to that in a minute. I just want to augment the point, or emphasize the point about the Fourth Industrial Revolution and the reality that the unique characteristics of the current period of human evolution where we are seeing the convergence of emerging technologies that are changing our lives in a significant way rather rapidly, it means that we know a few things. We know that emerging technologies scale much quicker than in previous revolutions. We know that technology dissemination is rapid, irrespective of whether the governance systems exist in a jurisdiction to regulate them. And we also see that these innovations can often disrupt existing social structures, from taxation through to labor markets, through to human interaction. And so when we talk about agility in government, it's really about acknowledging the rapid pace of technology innovation, which means that the governance of these technologies, the business models that they enable, and the social implications requires policymakers to not have to go it alone anymore. Or to put it more eloquently, that governance in the fourth industrial revolution, or 4IR, can no longer be limited to governments alone, but has to be a multi-stakeholder effort. And so it's important here for us to say quickly, what's the difference between GovTech and Agile governance? Well, actually, both notions highlight that there is a real need for governments to adopt a mindset shift. And actually, I like that Aaron in the previous session had alluded to that, because it's not just about embracing new approaches to policymaking. It's also about empowering civil servants with the digital skills and governments with the digital infrastructure to be able to navigate the evolution of emerging technologies. And so by this, a concrete example is where in GovTech, there's a lot more discussion about digitizing government, enabling a digital infrastructure by leveraging technologies like blockchain, which Martin alluded to in terms of Estonia, to ensure transparency and accountability of government services. Agile governance is focused much more on shifting how policy making as a process in and of itself is done. And here it's more looking at the governance of digital, if you could put it that way.
That's fantastic, and I think that definition or that distinction is really important, because what we're talking about today is this challenge of shifting policy making as a process. And you mentioned before in your remarks that one of the most important mindset shifts is around empowering civil servants, but another is this shift in who is responsible for policy and who is engaged in that policy making process. Now, what role does multi-stakeholder collaboration then, as you put it, play in this, and what does it practically look like? How does it differ from the usual consultation or engagement processes of governments and policymakers that are built into many, not all, but many policy-making processes already today?
Well, this is what really excites me about this topic, because it is about revolutionizing policymaking in and of itself as part of this fourth industrial revolution period that we are at the precipice of. And it's truly just grappling with a very important issue at the heart of this, which is a question of trust, and the trust of people in their governments, in their corporates, and in their civil society and academic leaders. And so what's really interesting is actually Endelman did a trust barometer report that they released earlier this year, where they found that 61% of those surveyed felt that governments did not understand emerging technologies enough to regulate them effectively. The same report found that there was more trust in corporate leaders, CEOs, etc., than there was in policymakers to be able to successfully address national challenges. And so this, for us, is crucial insights, which indicate that multi-stakeholder collaboration has to be the way forward to bridge that trust gap between the average Joe and their governments, particularly when it comes to emerging technologies. And so for me, I think when we talk about multi-stakeholder collaboration, and having both been at the World Economic Forum for several years, that's a renowned institution for public-private collaboration, and it's important, particularly because when it comes to policy making, there's always concerns about lobbying or industry going out there and being completely unregulated and it being truly the Wild West, when in reality, it's a double-edged sword. You have industry who are innovating at a pace that is rapid and therefore beyond the capacity of governments to keep up with it. But at the same time, you also have industry wary of the fact that they have to self-regulate because they themselves are mindful that they don't have full information about these innovations and their impact on society. And so it is crucial that there is this nexus between public and private sector, but also bringing in civil society and academia to be able to do this. And so I want to share some concrete examples of what we mean by multi-stakeholder collaboration. One thing that is really exciting to see is that there is a proliferation of policy labs and regulatory sandboxes around the world. We've seen this experimentation in the fintech space in the UK. We've seen this in terms of autonomous vehicles in Sweden, as well as other jurisdictions like Finland and Singapore and the UAE. And these are key tools when it comes to creating innovative tech policies, because essentially policy labs and regulatory sandboxes are combining the principles of scientific labs, research labs, and product design to experiment, to test, to measure as it relates to technology innovation. And the reason why this is really important is because it helps to whittle down the time it takes to go through the traditional legislative process, where civil servants will go and research a law or regulation. They will hold consultations. They will then come back to get political buy-in before going through the legislative branch of government and getting approval. And as an example, GDPR took 4 years to develop, and a further 2 years, so in total 6 years before it was enforceable, by which point technology innovation has meant that there were a number of new issues that had to be grappled with that wasn't covered under GDPR, which is why the European Commission is going through its digital data and AI policies to help supplement some of the core issues that weren't addressed sufficiently by GDPR. Another concrete example is the work that we've been doing at the World Economic Forum around the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And for the audience who haven't come across that, essentially the forum stepped into the void of multi-state and multilateral institutions by providing a neutral, impartial platform to be able to bring private sector and governments together alongside academia and civil society to essentially co-design the policies needed to address governance gaps related to emerging technologies. And one of our early success stories, a real game changer for a jurisdiction like Rwanda, was to be able to facilitate the government to create the most advanced self-performance based drone regulation to facilitate the development and use of drones for commercial purposes, particularly in terms of delivering bloods and medicines to rural communities in Rwanda. And that was done in the period of 4 months through parallel consultations, through co-designing and collaboration between the different actors, the drone developers, the airline companies, the government, etc. And this was done because there was a void. There wasn't a sufficiently advanced drone regulation that would facilitate the commercial use of these drones in Rwanda or anywhere else in the world at the time that already took into account issues around civilian aircrafts flying over. And if you fast forward today, having piloted that policy within a 9-month period and have been iterated it, Rwanda has the largest civilian operated drones network in the world. The policy that was developed and piloted in Rwanda is now being used in India in terms of using drones for agriculture purposes. It's now being used in Israel as the basis of thinking through how to use drones in an urban setting for delivering medicines and other PPE equipment for COVID, combating COVID cases. And so these are pragmatic ways of really leveraging the power of multi-stakeholder collaboration in an innovative way for issues such as addressing the pace of governance in the Fourth Industrial Revolution.
But the the issue that I was picking up there is that we have a number of different criteria to assess what is an effective agile governance approach. And you mentioned there are a few. So one of them was keeping up with the change and pace of technology. And I know Amazon has had challenges in the past with its drone regulation, where by the time it submitted a drone for certification, the certification process was out of date compared to the technology, etc. So one of them is keeping pace, but another big one is inclusion. And as we come towards the end of our time here, how do you manage inclusion when governments have a very different set of responsibilities around governance when you think about the consumer or citizen at the edges of the distribution compared to companies that focus on their addressable market and tend to govern for their typical user? Is there something here that you've taken away from the work at the World Economic Forum or the policy lab or sandbox approaches around how you include vulnerable or marginalized or perhaps just less commercially viable citizens into these governance design processes?
That's an excellent question. And actually what we are seeing is the beauty of technology is that it has empowered the individual to be able to interact directly with their political representatives and their heads of states and heads of government, right? We all know of some very famous heads of states who use social media platforms to interact not only with their citizens, but to essentially, whether good or bad, make policy using 140 characters or less, or take clear positions in a very swift way. And so in some ways, the fact that these marginalized communities were previously found it much harder to integrate into the governance process or share their viewpoints unless they were actively solicited by governments, actually have the ability to really interact with their legislature representatives through social media platforms. The other more interesting and really thoughtful process is actually through initiatives like in Finland, they have set up a digital platform called a Place to Experiment, which effectively facilitates crowdsourcing solutions and enables individuals to be able to share ideas or identify concerns about their public services or their communities, and facilitates that interaction with civil service and policymakers to be able to address those gaps. And so we are seeing a greater response to governments from their citizens to be able to opine more directly rather than just through their representatives. And so that is encouraging. Are we at a place where this is happening widely enough? No. And that's why it's important for institutions like the World Economic Forum, when we speak about multi-stakeholder collaboration, we really are talking about more than just public and private sector. And I think that's part of the narrative of agile governance. It has to be more than just public and private sector. It must include civil society and academia, where those marginalized voices are much better represented.
Well, thank you, Nima. I think we're coming to the end of our time here at Cog Extra. I kind of just maybe want to mention a couple of the key points that you highlighted there. This idea of government adapting to a rapidly changing age, but not doing so alone, I think is the core takeaway here for agile governance. And the second aspect is the proliferation of examples around the world. So governments are not just doing this alone in terms of being the only stakeholder responsible, but they're also experimenting all around the world in different ways. And so there is a huge opportunity for learning across jurisdictions, across policymaking units, both within government and across different governments, whether they be national or subnational. So I want to say thank you very much, Nima Elmi, for being our expert here on agile governance in the Cog Extra Fireside Chat. And thank you to all of you in the audience, as well as the producers, for supporting us and having been part of this conversation.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Nima.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.